So welcome. This is the Easton Historical's second season of doing summer tours. I want to say that this year we're aiming to do tours that last about an hour. And for the most part, we're going to be outside of North Easton at some of the other places in town. Right now, we're here in Easton Center. One other thing that I should make clear, since we have our curator and a member of our board of directors here, the opinions expressed are my own. They are not the opinions of the Easton Historical Society or the Easton Historical Commission. So if I should inadvertently tell the truth, it's not their fault. Okay, so we're over here. One of the big reasons we're over here is this is where the shade is, but the other important reason is that I want to start off with geography. That's always the best way to start. And if you look in that direction, that's the start of the Hockomock Swamp. 16,000 acres of swampland, 4,000 of which is here in Easton. And the Hockomock Swamp is a legitimate swamp. Starts off with this red maple area here and gets wetter and wetter the further back you go. It's an important feature of our town because it's a thing that helps prevent flooding. It serves as a gigantic sponge. Everything runs in that direction and hopefully stays there and doesn't flood the town. But if you take a look at this rock right here, that shows you that right here in Southeastern we're very, very consistent, because this rock is the remnants of a swamp that was here 300 million years ago. Okay, and the top layer here is very, very fine grained, which means that the water settled, the mud settled very, very slowly. So that was a legitimate swamp. And then if you come over here and take a look at the edge, you see that in here, there's a bunch of rocks running through it. This was a stream bed that ran through the swamp because flowing water moves the rocks, and eventually things got in here. Now, if I was really energetic, I could probably try to break that rock off, but I don't think I want to do that. I'll tell you about it though. At this time, 300 million years ago, the #1 resident of Easton was a 5-foot-long salamander with a really, really big head. He would have, if he could have caught you, which he couldn't, because he was a salamander, he didn't walk that well, he would do a lot of damage, big teeth and all of this. This is the Pennsylvanian age, 300 million years ago, otherwise known as the age of amphibians. Okay, there weren't reptiles, birds, or mammals at that time, just frogs and giant salamanders. Okay, but this kind of rock leads to the biggest story here in Easton Center. It's called the Devil's Footprint, and the great story was, once upon a time, in the early days of the town, the devil appeared. And he popped out of the Hockomock Swamp, jumped on a field that up until Reverend Chaffin's time in the late 1800s never ever grew grass or anything like that. He made another stop, and then finally he jumped here, and he jumped so hard he landed on one of these rocks and left his footprint. Then he jumped to the other side of the field over here and left another footprint. The official Devil's Footprint is located over here. The way that you find it is you go to the end of this fence and then look into the backyard of the people on Porter Street. Now, the best time to see this is in the early part of the fall, before all the leaves cover the rock, but after the poison ivy dies. Okay, I went over there and checked it out today. You don't want to go near it. It's all poison ivy. So the Devil's Footprint is over there. Now, what is the Devil's Footprint? Well, it looks like the imprint of a cloven hoof. It really does. And what it is what geologists call differential weathering. And eventually this rock here is going to fall out and leave a hole. And with the devil's footprint, it just happened to fall out on the top up here, got washed out or eroded away, leaving an imprint. If you walk over to the other side of the school, and there's a nice cut so that the kids can walk home, you walk through there, take a left, and there's another stone that looks like this, and there's sort of an impression there, which we think is that second devil's footprint. Okay? So, why is this area called Easton Center? Does anybody know?
The town hall was over there.
Town hall was over there, yeah. Okay. Why was the town hall there?
Is it exactly the center of the outline?
Yeah, it isn't. And that's part of the story. Basically what happened was that the very first people to come to Easton settled down on Washington Street on Route 138 where the car wash is, and down that street towards Turnpike. And another group of people settled way over on Bay Road because Bay Road was an Indian trail.
Right.
Okay, so the people over here built the first church. That's why we have Church Street, and the cemetery there, which we're actually going to visit later in the series this summer, actually had the original church, the original meeting house, which is probably about as big as your sheds. It's even about the size of my shed. It was really tiny, but the population was small. So when the town grew a little bit, the question is, what are we going to do? We need to build a new meeting house. And a fight broke out about where they should put it. Okay, they actually measured where the center of town is, and the exact center of town is about where Black Brook and Depot come together. So it's further this way. And that's halfway up and halfway right and left. But a compromise was reached because the people over here were more adamant and probably more numerous. So they decided to build the first church on the corner. And we'll talk about that when we get there. Let's start walking. So here we are, still in the shade. If you take a look back, you can see the school. And that school was built in 1955 with an addition in 1966. Prior to that, the town ran the poor farm here. So the land that is now the little housing development off of School Street, and this land here, probably up to about where this tree is, was part of the poor farm. At some point here, there was a building that's listed on early maps as the town, the town hall or town building, and I'm still trying to figure out what that was, whether it was just a place you came to pay your bills or whether they actually had meetings inside. We'll talk about that when we talk about the churches. But the poor farm sounds pretty bad. You know, you get sent to the poor farm. But it was a big step up for Easton. If you were a poor person in colonial Easton, what they would do is they would auction you off each year to the lowest bidder. So if you were a young but mentally challenged person, you would fetch a high price because you could theoretically do some work. If you were an old person who couldn't work, then you would get an incredibly low price. Now, if you paid a lot for somebody, you'd probably feed them well, but if you didn't pay a lot for somebody, you're not going to feed them the really good stuff. So there were real abuses, and many elderly people got sick and died under this system. So what happened in the early 1800s is the town allowed private, what we would call today, nursing homes. Okay, and one of them was run by a man named Albie Willis, who lived out on Bay Road. And so many people died at his nursing home that the town finally decided to take over the business of running a poor farm. So what they did is they built a house here, a nice big farmhouse, later had an addition on the back for more room. And when people got too old or too handicapped to take care of themselves, they would come to the poor farm, which was managed by a farmer. The idea was to raise as much of the food as they needed as possible, and it probably was okay. We always have thought that it was a place for people who were handicapped or elderly. It turns out that if you actually look at the records, that's not exactly true. I'll give you the example of a boy, Irvin Dickerman. Now, if you're familiar with Easton, you know up in Unionville there's a street called Dickerman Road, and there's a big old colonial house up there. That's the Dickerman House. They moved over from Stoughton just in time for the Revolutionary War, and the family was kind of well established. But one of the members of the family, Stephen, had some kind of a problem, as did his wife. They had 4 kids, and all of a sudden in 1850, after years and years of living out on the road, out in Unionville, they ended up here. He only lasted about 12 weeks, and she only lasted about 29 weeks. And then the town was left with the 4 kids. None of the other Dickermans in town would take them over. And so they ended up at the poor farm. So the farm served as an orphanage. And Irving was 4 years old when his parents died, and he had an older brother who was 7, and then the other 2 kids were younger still. The town kept the family here until they got old enough to be apprenticed out. And Irvin was apprenticed out to a shoemaker over on Foundry Street, and that was a profession that he stuck with the rest of his life, except for the 3 years that he was in the Civil War Army. He served his full Civil War Army years, got his pension, went out west, and like a lot of the Civil War soldiers, got married kind of late for the time period in his 30s. Maybe a suggestion that there was some PTSD, and he lived out the rest of his life. Just as he had sort of started his life in an institution here in Easton, he ended up in old soldiers' homes around the turn of the century. And we know that he was 5'5" tall, that's shorter than me, blue eyes, and by the time he was described at the old soldiers' homes, of course he had gray hair, rheumatism, hemorrhoids, and a couple of other illnesses, but he was still sharp as a tack. And he had a daughter that would come to visit him, and ended up, I guess, living for the time a pretty happy life. So this wasn't just a terminal place for people to come before they passed away. It could also serve as a positive place, as a launching pad for better times. It was also a place that after the Civil War served as the hub of hoboism in Easton. If you were a hobo, which is someone traveling for work, many hobos actually were traveling but not necessarily looking for work. So here in Easton, if you were a hobo, you could stay one night at the poor farm. And in the 1890s, when there was a depression here in the United States, there were dozens and dozens of hobos who spent their one night here. You actually got a ticket. You got a ticket to spend your night here, just like you would get a ticket on a train. If you were a rowdy hobo, the town lockup was also located on the poor farm's property. Now, taking care of indigent people was not a problem that has gone away, and things keep changing. In the time of the Depression, basically the state and the town allocated money to buy food and groceries for people that were out of work. And at that point, you either went to the town hall and picked up the groceries, or the selectmen, who were called the overseers of the poor, would come and drop the stuff off at your back door so that you wouldn't be embarrassed that you were on welfare. That's the start of the current welfare system. That made the poor farm superfluous, and so in 1942 it was discontinued, and for 12 years the town sold off that chunk over there but kept this chunk, thinking that one day we would have a use for it, and in 1955 they put the school in here. Now this wasn't the first school that was here, as we'll see in a few minutes. Easton Center, as somebody pointed out, was where the town hall was, and back in the 1700s what that meant was that it was also where the church was, because everybody was a Congregationalist, whether they liked it or not. Okay, and a lot of people in Easton didn't like it, and we have a history of people fighting for the rights of religious freedom. And what happened was eventually you could have your own church as long as you paid the taxes that helped pay for the congregational minister, because he was the smart one. He had gone to Harvard, whereas Baptist ministers in the early days either learned the trade from another minister or went to a less expensive university, which turned into Brown. Ultimately, that was deemed to be unfair, and in 1831, church and state were separated. But prior to that time, town meeting was held in the town church, okay, which was one of the reasons why it was an argument to where the church was going to be located. The impression I get from early Easterners is, if I lived over in Bay Road and it was a really rainy day, I might not want to go to church, but everybody wanted to go to town meeting because that's where you set the taxes for the year. So the church was built right across the street where this brick house is, and that was the congregational meeting house. And in the back there was a two-story chapel, which was kind of interesting. It was interesting that when we had one of our innumerable church controversies, the congregational minister actually got kicked out of his own church by the Unitarians, who were the liberals that were coming along. And so he went and preached in the chapel until they built the church, which stood where the church is today. Okay. Now, Mr. Shelton was sort of a conservative guy. In many ways. He was a strong anti-slavery man, but women, that was a problem. And you couldn't expect the men and women to sit together in the small chapel. Luckily, it was 2 stories tall. So the women were preached to on the 2nd floor by Reverend Shelton, and they cut a hole in the floor in front of the pulpit so the men downstairs could hear him. Okay. This becomes an issue later on, and we'll talk about that in just a second, because there were women in town that were a lot like that Megan Rapinoe, who were really fighting for women's rights. She's the person I'm talking about lived right next door, so let's go next door. All right, so we're standing in front of the Reed House. And we'll talk about its tragic history a little bit later, but its initial story was pretty good. The town had controversies with its ministers for about 30 to 40 years. The guys would come in and all sorts of problems emerged. One guy was a wife beater. Can you imagine that? We just learned that. Now, part of the reason was his wife had strong religious ideas that disagreed with her husband, and some people were willing to to cut the minister some slack. That didn't stop the good burghers of Easton from hiring this guy, but things went south really quickly. Then they brought in another guy, fairly good minister. He served during the time of the Revolutionary War. The only problem was another wife problem. The wife drank too much, okay? So eventually he had to leave town too. He might have drunk a little bit too much as well. So finally in 1785, a young man, William Reed, just was ordained by Harvard. You know, first job, will work cheap. So the town hired him. Now, he had an interesting backstory. He came from, I believe it was Abington, and when he was about to be ordained, he went to the Poole family, relatives of our Pooles over in Easton here, and suggested to the oldest daughter that she should accompany him to the ordination. And she refused. Not to be put off, he asked the second oldest daughter whether she would go with him. And she said no. This guy must have been a real prize. He finally asked the youngest daughter, who was, I think, 14 years younger than he was, would you go to the ordination with me? And she said yes, if you will buy me material to make a fancy gown. They made the fancy gown. It was scarlet silk, which doesn't seem like what you'd want a minister's wife to be wearing. This is a special woman. Her name was Olive Poole. And so she wore that to the ordination, and a month later, that's what she wore for her wedding gown. And they moved here, and she was here until 1850. He died, sadly, in 1809. He was the first really good minister we'd had in a long time. He managed to avoid most of the controversies that were rolling at the time. Some of them were actually rolling in his family. There were arguments between the conservative Congregationalists and the liberal Unitarians. And his children, and I'm pretty sure Olive, were on the liberal side. We don't quite know where Reverend Reed was. But we do know that when Reverend Reed died unexpectedly in 1809, the man that they hired, Luther Sheldon, was a conservative. He's the guy that had the hole in the floor cut out. Now, the interesting thing is that good old Olive made sure that 3 of her kids graduated from college. And that was pretty amazing for the time. She had 7 sons and 1 daughter, and 3 of them managed to make college graduation. One of them, David Reed, became a Unitarian minister and the founder of one of the founders of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Okay, so where did Olive stand on this? Well, we don't know. Why? Women weren't allowed to talk. Women weren't allowed to vote. But that didn't stop Olive. Okay, we know from a newspaper article that in 1840 she signed her name to a petition along with 89 other people in town opposing slavery in the District of Columbia. That was looked upon as a good first step to getting rid of slavery in the country, banning this sale of slaves and slavery in Washington, D.C. Her name was on the top of that petition. Okay, we also know that she got kicked out of the Congregational church, the church that her husband was the minister of. When Mr. Shelton took over, she was a little bit too liberal, and she spoke out. So she got the boot. Okay? That's ironic because the Sheltons, husband and wife, were abolitionists as well. They opposed slavery. The difference was that Mrs. Sheldon was willing to go along with this separate but equal rule, where the women would have their little anti-slavery meeting and the men would have their little anti-slavery meeting, and oh, by the way, the guys got to make all the decisions. Okay? Olive wasn't going to put up with that. So this house, to me, is of particular importance because a founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society was born here. And one of our first, and probably our earliest, feminists lived here as well. So it's really, really sad that the house has been allowed to go to rack and ruin. It's in terrible condition, probably is no longer salvageable. And I have to say that the Historical Commission has done its darndest to save it. Members of the Historical Society have looked into purchasing this. A number of times the Historical Commission, up to like last year, have looked into purchasing this. The owner of the property is sitting on it because the house itself isn't valuable to him. The property is valuable. It's, you know, in Easton. Now developers we've had look at this place say it's way too close to the street. The asking price at one point was $500,000. I don't think you could get $500,000 right now, but it would cost about $500,000 to fix this building up. After Olive died in 1850, her family continued to live here, and a grandchild or great-grandchild became known as the shop girl's friend, because what she did was they ran a farm here, poultry farm. She was a Rankin, actually, they would go over to Brockton, and if there was a sick girl working in the department stores along Main Street in Brockton, they would offer this as a rest home for them to come and regain their health and then go back to work. So for over 100 years, this this building here was a important centerpiece of the town. Okay? And it's kind of sad to see that it's probably going to end up as God knows what. The area is zoned residential, so thank God we're not going to get a strip mall, but who knows what will happen here. Across the street, to just show you what good development can do, the area over there where that green duplex and the White House next to it are located was the site of Johnny's Cider Mill, the late lamented Johnny's Cider Mill. Everybody loved the cider from Johnny's, and I wish it was still here. It was really the best cider around. But when the owner died, there was a very, very complicated probate process, and so the property, the majority of the heirs wanted to see it turned into a strip mall, which would require it to be rezoned, and the town and the neighborhood sort of rose up in righteous indignation and said, no, we don't want that. And so what we did end up with are these two houses over here, which I think, given the way McMansions pop up all over town, they did a very, very good job of fitting these in. They sort of do fit the neighborhood. So that's the kind of redevelopment I would like to see over here, if we can't save this. The place where we're standing right here is part of the original house. The original house was a boxy colonial and then was added onto. We'll see the additions as we walk along. Let's walk a little bit. It becomes even clearer why we might not be able to save the house. There's beginning to be unbelievable structural damage. The original house was this gable end here going in that direction. This is an addition that was put on later, and this many people feel was a modern addition, but actually shows up in pictures of in the 1870s. So all of the house is over a century old, and this is 2 centuries. All right. The big X doesn't mean there's treasure buried there. What it means is if there's a fire, the fire department doesn't have to expend a great deal of effort to put the fire out just to protect the property surrounding. Okay, it's condemned. That doesn't mean that if you have enough money and no financial sense, that you couldn't still save this building. Okay. Sadly, its very last occupants were the students from Stonehill College who rented apartments in here, and when they left stuff in the refrigerator where the refrigerators were all turned off, and they had a population of cats who stayed, and if you go inside, it kind of smells like cat. Some people who have been in there say it would be impossible to get the smell out, but I don't believe that. We had a very famous school teacher who smoked like a chimney, and when she passed away, they were able to sell her house without the cigarette smell in it. So for a long time, there was a church across the street. The last one to be there was built in 1816, replaced in 1833 by one that looked very much the same, and then that one burned down in 1886. At that point, the town bought the land and built a really ugly looking town hall. I mean, it was serviceable. That ultimately was superseded by the town offices, which were in the old post office building up in Northeastern, and then finally by our beautiful town hall today. So that building was torn down, but the story is that when this house was built in the 1950s, the beams in the foundation come from the original townhouse, so at least part of it's still there. Okay. So when the church split in the 1830s, after the Congregationalists were forced into the chapel, actually before that they went over to the minister's yard. He stood up on the stone wall and preached from there for a while. But they eventually get the use of the chapel, and then finally in 1839 they built the church over here. That church also burned down. Churches seem to burn down a lot. Reason for that is lightning strikes. It certainly wasn't from heating the churches, because the early churches had no heat at all, and then the later ones had very minimal heat. You know, you're supposed to be building your character when you're going to church. But this one burned down in 1882, and the one you see here now was built in 1886. And that's the Congregational Church. Whether that stays much longer is sort of an open question. It's a very small congregation. We do have two Congregational churches in town, the larger one's up on Center Street, and this one has a slate roof, which is incredibly expensive to replace. And what?
I think that's up for sale.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's up for sale. God knows what will happen. So it is protected by our demo review bylaw, but that doesn't protect it absolutely. What you need here, and what we don't have, is a local historic district like in Northeastern, and that would have protected this house and would protect that. We don't have that. It's a complicated process to get it, and hopefully something can be worked out along the lines of the church up on William Street. That was turned into a house, the one that has all the solar panels on the side. The old Masonic temple, you guys probably know it as. Let's walk down this way. We're almost done. So once upon a time, this was a real center of activity for the town. There was the church, the town hall, there was an inn located, well, probably where Porter Street comes through, up above, next to the minister's house. And the idea of having that was that church, where you're all supposed to go, lasted from morning till late in the afternoon with a break in the middle. Okay, so the afternoon session became a little more bearable when everybody ran across the street and went to the inn. Ultimately, there was also a school here. The very first school was put in 1793 when the town was broken down into 4 districts. Eventually it was broken down into 11 districts, 10 schools. This was District 9. And so there was a school built in 1793. There was one built early in the 19th century. And the building in back of you over here was built in 1856. Okay. Now, sadly for equal rights, the young ladies didn't fare a whole lot better here. They were allowed to go to school with the boys, but there was a separate boys' entrance and a separate girls' entrance, so there wasn't a lot of mingling. And it was a 1-grade school. You would go here from first grade, there was no kindergarten at the time, through probably what we would consider to be middle school, 8th grade. If you wanted to go on to college, for a few years here in the 1850s, you would probably either go to a private academy where you'd pay, and there was actually one in the old chapel for a few years over there, or you would read Greek and Latin with the town minister and then go to Harvard and become something. By this time, it wasn't just a minister. You could become a lawyer or even a scientist. Ultimately, after the Civil War, the town decided to build its first high school. And they didn't quite know how to manage that because everybody was spread all over the place. You know, there were kids down in Furnace Village who wanted to go to high school, and there were kids in Northeastern that wanted to go to high school. Where to put it? Well, more people were in Northeastern, and the Ameses agreed to pay for it, so the school building was built up there. The very first session of the high school, however, was held in Furnace Village. They had the plan to alternate between the big building on the corner of South Street and Highland Street and the big building up in Northeastern. That didn't last for very long, and everybody started to go up to what ultimately became Oliver Ames, which is still up there.
Was the first high school named Oliver Ames?
No, the first high school was named Easton High School, and if Oliver Ames had anything to say about it, the one that was named Oliver Ames would have been named Easton High School. It only was named for the governor when he died during construction, and the school committee decided to name it that way. And then we all discovered, if we told people we graduated from Oliver Ames, they all thought we went to private school, and that helps get those first jobs really good. Okay, so we've kept the name. There are people in the Hockomock League who don't say they're coming to Easton to play a game, they're coming to Ames to play a game. So, but there's a rub to that, and we'll talk about that in about 2 seconds. First of all, I want to point out the church, 1886, and there's this thing called hubris, and New England church steeples seem to be the example of that around here. The church steeple on this original building was gigantic. It went up and up and up and up and up, much higher than what we have here, until it was struck by lightning and came down, down, down. So wiser heads prevailed, and this was put on here. This too has been struck by lightning within my lifetime, and a small fire broke out there. So this is actually an interesting building. It has the same kind of stained glass windows in it that are on the sides of Unity Church. Not the Lafarge windows and not the conic window at the back, but the McPherson windows. This, to my way of thinking, is McPherson glass. That's actually, you know, you can't save everything, but that's something that's worth saving because he was an important figure in American stained glass making. So hopefully good things will happen here, but the way things generally work out, it probably won't. So we're in Easton Center, the center of the town. I'm very proud. I live right down the street. You can see the bad landscaping and the paint job that needs to be redone. When you, third house on the left, don't look. So you would think we'd get some props here. When this memorial went up in 1882, it was called Monument Square. Sounds very impressive. What's the story behind that? Well, at the same time that the town voted $5,000 to build this statue to the Civil War dead, the Ames family brought in Frederick Law Olmsted to build the Rockery. And they also built Oaks Ames Memorial Hall, which was supposed to be the town hall. Okay. There was a little problem. Lots of people in town didn't like Northeastern. Okay. Part of the reason was a really bad reason. They didn't like immigrants. Oh, wait a second. That's a problem we still have, isn't it? But Northeastern was the land of immigrants. Southeastern was the land of Yankees, and, well, those damn Irish are here. We can't do anything about it, so what the hell. But, you know, Northeastern had a very high percentage of all sorts of immigrants working at the shovel works. And God damn it, it was shovel works. They weren't good farmers like the rest of the town. And so the Ameses weren't necessarily as popular as they might have been. So they built the Rockery. The town meeting voted $5,000 for this memorial here at the center of town in front of the town hall that was going to stay the town hall forever and ever. And that $5,000 was more than the school budget for that year. So they didn't skimp on this. It was completed in 1882 and dedicated on Memorial Day, which was a pretty new holiday at that time. Prior to that, in recognition of the fact that the town had different parts. There were 3 Memorial Day parades. You know, one went to the Catholic Cemetery in North Easton, one went to the cemetery, I think it was on Washington Street, and one went to the one down in Furnace Village. So in order to, it was a godsend when they decided, yeah, we can do this, and we'll just send an honor guard to each of the cemeteries where men are buried to put the flags out. So this was dedicated in 1882, and Martlin's band played here. Martlin's band was a Brockton band, but it was the descendant of the Civil War band of the 12th Massachusetts Regiment, which had a lot of guys from Brockton and a lot of guys from Easton in it. That's why they were asked to come over. And that's an important part of the story too, because when they were out training on Fort Warren in the Boston Harbor, they heard a regular Army regiment play this old spiritual song, and they made up a joke song about it. And the joke song was John Brown's Body, okay, which the 12th Massachusetts played wherever they went. And it was a heck of a war that first year. They brought their band with them to the front, and they would serenade everybody until eventually they were kicked out. Band members served as stretcher bearers during a real battle, but that still didn't really justify their existence. So they were finally sent home, but not before Julia Ward Howe heard the song and said, "Nice song, terrible lyrics. Let me write the Battle Hymn of the Republic," and that's where it came from. So it had its start right here with Easton, and that's why they were honored by bringing them back here. All right, so some people, me usually, say, well, if you take a look at our Soldiers Memorial, it's facing south, which is good, because, you know, that's where those darn rebels came from, the south. On the other hand, maybe, just maybe, the memorial is giving a cold shoulder to Northeastern by facing in the other direction. Just maybe. We have no evidence for that, but it makes sense to me. So, I said it was going to take about an hour. I think we're close.
So, 15 after.
Oh, good. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about this part of town?
The neighborhood right up, it's called Split Rock Estates. Is
Yes.
it named after the stone you were talking about?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't believe so. I believe that when it was actually made, they put a big stone on one side and a big stone on the other side. I think you can. There's still one of them there.
Yeah, right by the,
Yeah.
Yeah.
by the road.
Yeah. So that's kind of an interesting way that the town got developed. As we've noted, all the houses that I've pointed out today, or all one of them, were built up on the street. This house right next door here is from the 1870s. It's another parsonage. There's 3 parsonages in the area. There's one up on Center Street that Luther Sheldon had. But this one was built in the 1870s, and again, it's close to the street. That's what everybody did in the olden days when the traffic didn't make this much noise, okay? So everybody built on the street, and there was empty space in back for your farm. So when the town started to get developed in the 1950s, what do? You cut a road like Porter Street through into the back lots, and that's where you put your development. So that's where development lasted, that brought our town from about 7,000 people to 23,000 people. And then what's happening now is that since everybody wants a McMansion, and since builders want to maximize their profit, if you find a postage stamp sized lot with an old house on it, you knock it down and build a house that's too big for the lot and too big for the neighborhood, and that's what Easton is beginning to look like. So the Historical Commission has a real hard time saving any historical house, and they have to work really hard at that, and they do a really good job, but it's a tough fight.
Do you want to mention the town pound?
Oh, I do want to mention the town pound. It's not there. There's Ann DeSantos back there. Hi, Ann. Hey, Ann, are you open?
Well, I don't have a student till 11, so I am going to open. We were closed last week, so I'm going to open in a couple minutes. Just
I won't be officially open, but I'll be open.
She'll be open. Let's give her a couple of minutes, and then we'll take a quick look inside. It's definitely worth going inside the old school, and that's a good way to finish the tour.
You can sit for
Yeah, the town pound, thanks to John DeSantis, we all thought it was here. In fact, there's a marker across the street said, you know, near this site there's a town pound. And it looked like there was an easement back here. And John was looking into the property, the people next door were looking into the property. He did research, and actually the town pound was up next to the minister's house. Now that makes sense because Luther Sheldon loved animals. And he loved little kids, so he would take in all sorts of stray animals, had turkeys and guinea hens and squirrels and magpies and, you know, everything you could think of, and all the kids in the neighborhood would stop by like it was a petting zoo. So it makes sense that the town pound was kind of put down there as well. We don't know what this easement was for, however, and now it's gone.
what can be done on an easement? What does it mean it's an easement?
Well, let me turn to an expert. Tell us about easements.
Easements mean that someone has the right to use that area that's designated an easement for the purposes for which the easement was granted. And basically they can do it for anything that the easement says, as long as it doesn't interfere with the rights of the landowner. So that someone still owns the land underneath, someone has the right to use it. Right. Yeah, you mentioned Dickerman died in the old soldiers' home.
Yes.
Is that here in Easton or somewhere?
No, that's a very good question. He never came back to Easton after the end of the Civil War, which kind of says maybe he didn't really enjoy the town home that much. So he moved out to the Midwest, the land of opportunity, and continued to be a shoemaker. He ended up first entering the soldiers' home in Minnesota, and then moved to and died in the soldiers' home in Tennessee. We did have soldiers' homes in this area. They were in Boston. And we actually did have a soldier, we have an unknown soldier or semi-unknown soldier that's in the Central Cemetery up here. If we did the 2-hour tour, we'd walk up to the cemetery. It took us a long time to figure out who this totally unrelated man was, and he was a distant relative of somebody in Easton, and they basically said, you know, he is completely decrepit, would you take him for his last years or last months really, and so he died in Easton and is buried here.
So this is called Depot Street?
This is called Depot Street.
Was there a depot?
Yes. If you look in back of this building, there's a smaller building that's falling down. That's part of the Easton Center Depot, okay? And the Easton Center Depot was down where Fernandes Lumber is, between Fernandes Lumber and the little auto shop in there. Yeah, you could still walk the tracks.
So there was a train?
Absolutely, it went through here, and then it went all the way down to Taunton, through the dog track and through the swamp. That's the proposed future route for the MBTA. Yes. And then there was also a line that in the area between Depot Street and Purchase Street, there was a road that went off called the Matfield line, and Matfield's part of West Bridgewater, so it went off into West Bridgewater and then hooked up with the Brockton line. Yeah.
That answers that.
And then there was a spur off of that went into the back of Simpson Springs, because Simpson Springs sold so much coffee soda to Macy's in New York that they needed a railroad siding.
Yeah, I did know
Yeah.
that, but I didn't know where the depot was here.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Ed. You were awesome.
Yeah.
I didn't know you had all this knowledge in there.
Oh, I got more. You haven't heard half of it. Like when you get back to your car, at the edge of the rink,
Yes.
there's a tiny pink flower.
Yeah.
That's a pimpernel. Okay. Now, just to show you that everything is connected to Easton, there's a famous novel called The Scarlet Pimpernel. Scarlet Pimpernel. And in the 1930s, a movie was made called The Scarlet Pimpernel. And it's all about rescuing people from the French Revolution. And the reason he was the Scarlet Pimpernel is this beautiful little flower, but it's so tiny everybody ignores it. The movie starred Leslie Howard, okay? You might remember him as Ashley in Gone with the Wind. He was the one that wasn't Clark Gable. He was also a great and good friend of Winthrop Ames and spent many a day at our Queesit, where the library now has its thing. Yeah, so there's a connection with everything, and the door just opened, so let's go. So not only was this a school, but after it ceased being a school, it was used by the VFW before they moved up to Rockland Street. You can see how the place was heated. There was a stove that would sit in the middle here, and the story is that the kids would be so cold, they sit so close to the stove that their clothes would start to smoke, and the leather on their shoes would be burned. Okay. But now it's a wonderful place to come for gifts, and of all old-time things, from records to books to jewelry. And pianos, yes.
And John also
Yes.
does a great job tuning.
Yes, he
pianos.
does tune pianos.
And I have this book I've been saving for you.
Aha!
It's a Bible, but it had all kinds of inscriptions from various famous Eastern names. Who was born, who was married. Look at that.
Yeah, birth, deaths, and marriages.
From 1792 forward, the books from the Bibles from the 1800s. I collect dilapidated Bibles.
Well, they're important because they have a lot of family records that no one else can have.
See, it says "Give to Ed Hands" right on
There we
it.
go.
Great.
And you finally got me in here.
Yeah.
We're going to send this right up to the Historical Society.
Yeah, so it might answer a few questions
Yeah.
on a few missing links, maybe.
Bravo. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I love old Bibles. Old Bibles are.
Me too.
People took the time to document things. We go around clicking our phone with 10,000 pictures in it and never print one. Hope we don't dunk it in our coffee. But the old Bibles that put those monumental dates and
That's a treasured item.
isn't that a nifty piece? I just love the handwriting and
Married in Easton, Mass, July 7th, 1809, by Mr. Gilt. He was Justice of the Peace. And Apollo Lincoln and Polly French of Norton.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so this is valuable.
That's great.
Quite a
Marvelous.
find.
Need a shot of that, Joe?
never underestimate a dilapidated book.
No. They don't all have to have covers. Try the front room too while you're here.
Yeah, there's little record rooms, and we had a music school here, so I kept the rooms and gave them all a theme. We're kind of, the third room's being
That's nice.
dismantled into a teaching room now, but it shifts a lot.
That's
We'll
good.
go to buy a nice piano to fix over, and then we'll buy something from the person moving.
Who does the carrying of the pianos?
We have real piano movers. That
Oh, okay.
they have to dismantle a grand, put it on its side, take the legs off, and take the pedal board off. And
Yeah,
yeah.
the Lions Club did that during Jump Day.
Yeah, it's really
Yeah.
If you lift it up high and just drop it, it kind of falls apart.
There is a piano graveyard on the North Shore. They send them all
Yeah.
to and push them over a cliff.
Yeah.
It'd be an interesting video.
It sounds great.
Yeah, it would be loud.
Yeah.
Babe Ruth involved in that?
No, it wasn't the Babe Ruth
Wasn't the
piano.
Babe
No, it was
piano,
it was an
it was
Easton
Yeah.
piano, and it was a baby grand. And
Wow.
Oh, Ed, I'm going to take a panel and put a see-through piece on here. We have a big old tin ceiling from when it was
Yeah.
a municipal
Great.
building.
yeah,
Yeah.
About this wide to the panels.
yeah. The last
They
time we were
chopped it
in
up
here,
years ago.
that John somehow pushed something out and showed
Yeah,
us.
so I might like block off some and paint them, and
That's a great
just so
idea.
people can see what the ceiling
great
used
to
to
see
look
that
like
house,
here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the front windows used to be the taller type, like a school.
hmm
But we kind of like it schoolhouse looking. It's always
Yeah.
we've always taught music here.
Yeah.
It's quite fun.
Yeah.
And I see you have a Rembrandt.
Oh yes, it's a real one. So
Yeah.
watch your step.
Yeah.
Right from the Gardner Museum.
Yeah.
We get into
That
history,
somehow that
right?
wouldn't surprise me if something showed up in Easton from there.
My husband's great was in Massachusetts.
Oh.
art history professor dated
Oh
for
my
it's like
gosh.
from the year 1100 to 1300.
Oh my gosh.
It's a
From the
ceramic
Middle East.
lamp, oil
Yeah.
lamp. And look at the beautiful, someone tried to use it, but look at how it's still clever with a cat and the
Yeah.
bird. And it's a triple wick, which is hard to come by. Usually the genie lamps just have two.
Right.
But it's just so amazing, the bronze, how it can be cast and like 1,000 years later be still sitting here. And I think,
1100 to 1300.
Yeah, 1100
Wow.
to 1300.
That's the Crusader period. That must have a
pretty
real,
old.
real story.
Yeah.
You know, how did it get here? Well, maybe it went to
Exactly.
Europe when somebody plundered it. And,
I don't know what the etchings, if they mean anything or if they just look like artistic. They look like a repeating
Yeah.
artistic pattern. But look at the cat.
yeah, it's flowers. Those are like
Yeah, it's like
almost like
petals
tulips.
or lotus
Yeah.
or something. That's
Very
probably
cool.
my coolest old piece.
Yeah, that is definitely cool.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to round these folks up and we're going to
Okay, guys.
head out. Thank you very
Thanks
much.
for dropping in. Oh, my
Yeah. This is the history room on Depot Street. So come and take a look. It's definitely worth the trip.
Yeah, wow.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I'm gonna drive down.
Let
and
me
pick
know if
right
you find any great finds in those names somewhere.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'll
will
make
do.
some connections with some of them, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
Take care.
All right.
Bye. Have a great day.
You too. All right, so thus endeth the tour. We're going to walk back now. Sorry, we should always do a circular tour, but hey, that's life.